Hi everyone and welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to learn on how you can create your own table in the database. If you're following this series, we have been working on the tables until now, which was in the DVD rental database, and we had different columns and all those columns had the data, but we did not create any table. But using the statement that is create table, we can actually create a new table in the database and we can define structure that include columns, names, data types, and any kind of constraints. What are constraints? Constraints are if you want a column to be unique, you want it to be not null, you want to be a primary key or it to work as a foreign key. We're going to look into the syntax and also in the example on how these constraints work. So the syntax is pretty simple. We use the statement that is create table followed by the table name, and then we start the parentheses. Inside the parentheses, the first value that goes is the column name followed by the data type. We have seen that we have different kind of data type like integer data type, characters data type, timestamp, then special, right? And then after that we define the constraint, that is not null, unique, primary key, or references. We're going to look into it, and then you end that statement by a comma, and then you write about the second column, and that's how you do it for all the columns you need in your table, and then eventually you close down the parentheses. So let us go to our PG admin and try to create a few tables and see how it goes. One thing to note is that until now we have been working on the DVD rental database. So please ensure that you do not create tables in this database. In fact, you right click on the database, click on create, and in the database you may write, let's say maybe YouTube as a database name, and click on save. Now it may give some error, you can ignore it, but if you see on the left hand side, you may not find your database. Why is that? You just right click on the database and click on refresh, and you may now see the database as YouTube. So let us click on it and right click on this and create the query tool. Now we already know this place a lot. So what do we do? Instead of writing queries by where we can fetch the data, we can also use this place query tool to create the tables in the database, and we can also insert the data that we're going to see in the next video. So how do we create the table? We say create table and table name. We want the table name to be account, and here I'll write the columns. The very first column that I need is the user ID, and its type is going to be the serial type. Now what is a serial type? Serial type is actually a special kind of data type which is usually used for the primary key column. So what's really happening is, let us suppose we add a new data and we want the value of the user ID to be incremented by a value. It will do it on its own. So we don't have to go ahead and add a user ID manually by our own. And one thing to also note that if the data is deleted between the serial key, it does not get adjusted, which means if there's a value in the table that is 1 2 3 4 5 6, and if by any chance the row which has the user ID as 5 gets deleted, so the next value we add, it's not going to be in the fifth column. So that fifth user ID will always remain as empty. I mean, it won't exist in the table, and you cannot assign that user ID to anyone else. So that's how the serial works. And serial also has different kind of small serial, big serial. You can actually check the Postgres documentation, and you can figure it out which one do you like, or which one is preferred for your use case. The next we need is the username. Of course, it is going to be varchar, that is variable character. And when we do that, we have to define the characters that we need inside the parentheses, and we want it to be unique, and we also want it to be not null because username cannot be null. And then we need a password, which should also be a varchar with 50 characters. We don't care if it's unique, but we definitely want it to be not null. And then it's followed by email, varchar. Email could be up to 150 characters, and we don't want it to be null. At the same time, the email should be unique too. And then we also want to store when this account was created. So we're going to say created on, use the data type as timestamp, and we want this to be not null. And then finally, we also want to store when was the account last logged in. So we're going to name it as last login, and then we want it to be timestamp. Okay, so if everything is good, remember in the last column I'm not putting up a comma, so which is okay, you don't have to do it. And if everything is good, yeah, and if I press F5 on my system, it says create table is done. And if you come to this under schema here on the left hand side under the tables, you can actually find account table, and in this we have 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 columns, actually 6 columns, with all the names that we have added. And if you look in the constraints, we also get account as the primary key. Like we have a primary key. So let us look at the properties definition, and we see as the column user ID is the primary key. So you can actually check inside the constraints. Okay, now that we have created one table, let us go ahead and create a few more table. And then what we'll do is we will connect one table with the other, and then we can see how we can work with the foreign key. So the next table we're going to create is the job table, which is going to have job ID. It is also going to be the serial, and we want it to be a primary key. Usually serial is used with the primary key column, and we want the job name, which should be varchar. It can have up to 250 characters, and we also want it to be unique and not null. All right, let us run it. Okay, tables created. And finally, the last table that we want is an account job, right? Maybe accounts where an account has applied for all the jobs. So we're going to name it account job. And here we need 3 columns. The first column is definitely going to be the user ID. But remember, we already have a table that stores all the users. So we're going to use that same column as a reference. So we're going to name it as user ID. And for the data type, we're going to say integer references. We use the keyword reference when we want to have a column as a foreign key. And then we write the table name, that is the account, and then inside the parentheses we tell which column we want to use as a foreign key, and that's how you do it. Similarly, we also want job ID, so we're going to say job ID, and you can, at this instance, you can name this column anything that you want, but it's preferred that you use the same column so that it is the other person following the database, they can understand it. So we're going to say integer, then references. And what table are we referencing to? We're going to reference the job table to the job ID column. And finally, we also want to store the hire date, so we're going to say hire date column name, and the data type would be timestamp. If that is all good, I actually missed to add the comma towards the end. Let us run it. And there you go, it says the table created. So let us right click on the YouTube and let us refresh it. And under the tables, we now have 3 tables: account, job, and job. So let's look at the job table. It has 2 columns, job ID and job name. And if you look at the constraints, we have a primary key. And if we click on the properties and check on the definition, we can see the job ID is the primary key. Similarly, if you go to the accounts table, we definitely have the 3 columns over here, but the interesting part to look here is the constraints, where we see that it has 2 foreign keys. How do you actually figure out that it has a foreign key or a primary key? That next to the column name, you will find a key. If it's a golden key, it's a primary key. If it's a silver key, it's a foreign key. So if I right click on one of the constraints, click on properties and go to the definition, actually columns, it will tell me the local table, the local column name is job ID. It is referencing to the job ID column in which table? In public.job table. Okay, similarly to what we have written here, we could also right click on the user ID, click on properties, go to the columns, and let us look at the query and try to relate. We have the user ID, the first one, it is the first one. The local name of the column is user ID. It is referencing to the user ID of which table? Accounts table. So that is how you actually create a database. You create tables, you add a structure, you create a primary key, and you also use references keyword to create foreign keys and connect 2 or more tables. In the next video, we are going to learn on how you can actually add and insert data in these tables that you have just created. So stick tight and I'll see you in the next video.